Bernard Montgomery stood at the edge of the British encampment as the first light of dawn crept across the endless desert, the pale horizon glowing like a thin blade cutting through the night, and for a moment he closed his eyes, letting the warm breeze brush against his face as if he were listening to the shifting sands whisper the secrets of another day of war, because in North Africa nothing remained still, nothing remained certain. And every grain of sand carried the scent of fuel, sweat, fire, and the ghosts of men lost in battles fought under a sun that punished both sides equally. Yet Montgomery did not fear this landscape the way others did. He understood it, respected it, studied it like a living organism whose moods and rhythms could be used as weapons, and as the British soldiers moved around him, checking vehicles, polishing gun barrels, preparing rations, he felt the weight of a truth that few grasped. Today would not be won by armor or artillery alone, but by the mind. That grasped the desert's pulse better than its enemy, and as he stepped forward, boots crunching softly over the sand, he looked toward the west where the Afrika Korps lay hidden beyond dunes and ridges, their tanks waiting, engines cooled, their commander, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, already awake, already analyzing, already plotting his next stroke with the precision of a master chess player. And Montgomery knew Rommel was the kind of opponent who struck fast, vanished faster, and left chaos in his wake. But that was precisely why Montgomery had been sent here, not to chase Rommel, not to outspeed him, but to break the rhythm of his war entirely. Montgomery studied every German movement over the past weeks, memorizing the strange elegance with which Rommel orchestrated attacks, how he used deception like a blade, how he let the desert swallow his forces only to unleash them in a sudden whirlwind of mechanized fury. And in the quiet before sunrise Montgomery whispered to himself the simple truth that defined his strategy. Speed is his weapon. Predictability will be mine. Predictability, a word most commanders feared, a trait no general wanted, but to Montgomery it was the anchor of a new kind of warfare, one that would deny Rommel the chaos he needed to thrive, because if Rommel was the fox darting through shadows, Montgomery would become the shadow itself, immovable, inevitable, always where Rommel expected to strike, yet never where he could land a decisive blow. And as British reconnaissance vehicles rumbled back into camp with dust trailing behind them, the reports were the same: German fuel convoys spotted moving through narrow passes, panzer columns adjusting positions near Alamein, artillery arranging in the distance like quiet thunder waiting to roar. But it was the final message that made Montgomery's jaw tighten, not with fear, but with confirmation. Rommel was preparing another lightning attack, hoping to break through the British line before Montgomery could fully establish his new defensive grid, and it was here, under this rising desert sun, that the silent duel between two of history's greatest battlefield minds sharpened into its deadliest phase. Montgomery walked toward his command tent, soldiers stepping aside with crisp salutes, and inside the tent maps sprawled across tables, marked with colored lines and tiny unit tags that represented thousands of lives, and as he stood over them, arms crossed behind his back, his mind began to weave the invisible net that would trap Rommel, not by force but by inevitability. He had planned defensive layers thick enough to absorb the shock of the German assault, artillery arranged to draw in the panzers like moths toward flame, anti-tank guns strategically positioned to create kill zones, and reserves hidden just far enough to strike when Rommel committed too deeply, and Montgomery felt a calm certainty filling him, the certainty that when Rommel came, he would find the British army standing like an iron wall. Meanwhile, far across the desert, Rommel himself studied the battlefield through field glasses, the morning sun glinting off their lenses as he observed dust plumes from British patrols, and he could not shake the feeling that something had changed within the enemy ranks. They were no longer scattering like frightened prey, no longer reacting with desperation but with calculated patience, and Rommel cursed under his breath, wondering what new commander London had sent to replace the indecisive leadership he had grown accustomed to outmaneuvering. Yet he knew instinctively that whoever this new leader was, he was not here to play the same losing game, and when a German adjutant approached with fresh intelligence reports, Rommel's suspicions deepened. British forces were consolidating with unusual discipline, supply lines were reorganized, defensive layers had thickened overnight. It was as if the British had shed their old skin and emerged as something dangerous. Back in the British camp, Montgomery's officers gathered around him as he briefed them with a clarity that cut through the tension like a blade, his voice calm yet firm, explaining how Rommel's habits, his favored angles of attack, and his reliance on rapid maneuvers would become the very tools Montgomery used against him, because Rommel, brilliant as he was, had become predictable to Montgomery's analytical mind. And as the officers nodded, absorbing the commander's confidence, they began to understand why German intelligence had already started whispering about this new British leader. Hitler himself had demanded reports, asking how one man had suddenly turned the stagnant British forces into a disciplined and unshakable opponent, and though they did not yet know his name, they feared the effect of his presence, for every movement they made was now met with resistance prepared hours before they arrived. And every strike met with counter-strikes too perfectly timed to be coincidence. As the sun climbed higher, turning the desert into a shimmering furnace, Montgomery stepped outside again, his eyes scanning the horizon as British soldiers prepared for the inevitable clash, and he could feel the pulse of war drawing closer, the invisible tension stretching across the sands until the first shots would break it, and in that moment Montgomery felt no fear, only clarity. He would not fight Rommel on Rommel's terms. He would force Rommel to fight on his. The British soldiers sensed this change in the air too. Whispers spread across the ranks, stories of their new commander who walked with calm certainty, who spoke plainly yet inspired confidence, who studied the enemy with a precision that bordered on eerie, and many began calling him the man who can stop the fox, though none understood yet how deeply Rommel himself felt the shifting momentum. Hours passed, the wind carried dust storms across the flats, and German scouts crept forward in the distance like silent predators seeking weakness. But everywhere they looked, British lines held firm, silent, waiting, and Rommel, watching through his field glasses, felt a rare flicker of unease, the same feeling he had only ever experienced before fighting generals like Patton or tacticians like Zhukov, and though he would never admit it. He felt as if someone was watching him back, someone who knew his thoughts before he acted on them, and he muttered under his breath, "Whoever commands them now, he understands me." And thus, as the sun reached its zenith and the desert shimmered with the heat of approaching battle, the two commanders, Montgomery, the immovable strategist, and Rommel, the elusive fox, stood poised on opposite ends of an arena carved by sand and fire, ready to begin a duel that would shape the fate of North Africa, a duel where one man relied on speed and instinct, and the other on foresight and discipline. And in the silent space between their armies, the desert itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see which mind would bend it to their will first as the long war for the soul of North Africa prepared to ignite once again. The desert heat intensified as the sun climbed higher, turning every grain of sand into a shimmering reflection of blazing light, and as midday approached, Montgomery stood once again before the vast map laid across his command table, tracing his finger along the ridges and wadis that would become the graves of German tanks by tomorrow if Rommel dared to advance, and he thought back to every report he had read about Rommel's tactics. How the desert fox always struck at the flanks, how he preferred to engage quickly and retreat before counterattacks could materialize, how he used feints and dust screens to mask his true intentions. But Montgomery was not interested in chasing tricks. He was interested in halting them permanently, and that meant building a defense so layered, so mathematically constructed, that Rommel's signature maneuvers would collapse upon contact, and with every hour that ticked by, British engineers hammered anti-tank obstacles into the hard desert ground, laid minefields stretching miles long, reinforced artillery lines, and positioned armor exactly where Rommel least expected it, not in the open plains he favored, but behind ridges and concealed positions that would reveal themselves only when the panzers fell into the trap. Across the desert, in the Afrika Korps headquarters, Rommel studied aerial reconnaissance photos with a furrowed brow, flicking ash from the cigarette balance between his fingers as he realized the British were no longer behaving like the disorganized force he had routed again and again over the past year. Instead, they had formed a disciplined, fortified, almost immovable shape along the horizon, and this worried him. For Rommel knew that his strength lay not in brute force but in outthinking opponents, and if this new British commander had anticipated his patterns, if he had mapped Rommel's instincts, Then the battlefield had shifted in a way that brute courage could no longer correct. Still, Rommel was not a man to be deterred by uncertainty, and as he leaned over the table, pointing at the map with sharp precision, he instructed his staff officers on the coming maneuver, a sweeping flank attack at night, executed with his most experienced panzer units, designed to break through the British line where they least expected it, then collapse the rest of their defense like dominoes. The same tactic that had won him victory after victory from Tobruk to Gazala, but unknown to him. Montgomery had already predicted this very move, building his defensive layers like a labyrinth that funneled enemy armor into a narrow corridor of fire, and as British units repositioned under the fading afternoon light, Montgomery walked among the men, speaking in calm, encouraging tones, reminding them that the coming battle would not be won by desperation but by precision, discipline, and trust in the plan he had forged, a plan designed not only to stop Rommel but to break the spell of invincibility that the Desert Fox held over Allied morale. As night approached, the air cooled, and a dark blue shadow spread across the desert floor, giving way to silence broken only by the soft rumble of engines turning over in the German lines, and Rommel himself climbed onto the turret of his command tank, raising his field glasses to observe the British positions glimmering faintly in the moonlight, and for a moment he felt the old thrill, the hunter's excitement, the anticipation of overwhelming an enemy with speed and surprise. But then that flicker of doubt returned, the memory of previous engagements where British countermeasures had been too perfectly placed, too perfectly timed, and he wondered for the first time if the man leading them now was someone who had studied him as deeply as he studied the desert itself. Meanwhile, in Montgomery's headquarters, lanterns flickered against the canvas walls of the command tent as officers gathered for the night briefing, and Montgomery spoke to them with the measured confidence of a man who understood that clarity was the greatest weapon leadership could offer in the chaos of war. He described how, "Before we continue, please let me know, did anyone in your family fight in or live through World War II? Share their stories in the comments. Let's continue the story. Rommel would likely strike tonight, how the Germans would attempt to sweep in from the south, how they would try to pierce through the thinnest-looking section of the line, unaware that it had been deliberately weakened as bait, and Montgomery instructed his officers to hold fire until the panzers committed fully, then unleash a coordinated barrage from artillery, anti-tank guns, and the 7th Armored Division waiting hidden behind a ridge, ready to sweep forward when the Germans were trapped. Midnight approached, a pale moon casting long shadows across the dunes, when the first rumble of German panzer engines echoed across the desert, growing louder as hundreds of tanks rolled into formation, their silhouettes cutting through the haze like steel predators on the hunt, and Rommel, watching from the front of the column, felt the adrenaline that had carried him through every major victory. But tonight that adrenaline was tinged with an undercurrent of unease, as though the air itself sensed the coming clash between two minds destined to decide the fate of this brutal theater of war. In the British lines, soldiers crouched behind sandbags. Anti-tank crews waited with fingers trembling slightly on triggers, and artillery teams whispered final checks as Montgomery walked calmly along the trench line, flashlight off, only the faint moonlight illuminating his silhouette as he nodded to the men, his quiet presence reassuring them that the trap was ready, and when the first German flares shot into the sky, turning the battlefield into a ghostly shimmer of white light, Rommel launched his attack, believing he had caught the British unprepared, only to discover moments later that the silence awaiting him was not fear, but calculation. The instant the German tanks advanced into the funnel Montgomery had designed, he lifted his hand, and a deafening roar erupted across the desert as British artillery unleashed a barrage so precise that German tank commanders were thrown into confusion, shells landing exactly along the path Rommel had chosen, minefields detonating beneath their tracks, anti-tank guns igniting the skies with streaks of fire. And for the first time in the North African campaign, the Afrika Korps found itself entering a battle where every move had been predicted before it began. Panzer after panzer erupted into flame, German infantry scrambled for cover only to be cut down by machine gun nests placed at perfect angles, and Rommel, staring in shock as his frontline units faltered, realized that the British were not reacting, they were waiting, as if they knew exactly when and where he would strike, and when he demanded reports, the same message echoed again and again. The British are already positioned, they anticipated this attack. But Rommel could not retreat, not yet. He signaled his reserves forward, deploying additional tanks to reinforce the assault, and under the harsh moonlight the desert became a cauldron of fire, explosions shaking the ground as German armor pushed deeper into the trap, unaware that Montgomery had reserved the deadliest strike for the moment the panzers fully committed. From behind the ridge, the 7th Armored Division roared into motion, tanks charging forward with blazing headlights, engines screaming as they descended upon the exposed German flank, and when Rommel saw the sudden surge of British armor crashing into his side, he felt a rare surge of dread, because this maneuver was not a reaction, it was a counterstroke crafted in advance. A move designed specifically to punish his signature tactic of deep penetration, and as the British tanks smashed into the German column, the Desert Fox confronted something he had not experienced in North Africa before, the feeling of an opponent who understood him too well. Montgomery, from his command post, watched the German formation buckle, the panzers falling into disarray as they tried to reorganize under the crushing pressure of artillery, tank fire, and infantry assaults, and though the battlefield was still engulfed in flames and chaos, he felt the weight of inevitability settling into his bones. Rommel had met the wall he could not break. The battle raged into the early hours of the morning, but as the first hints of dawn touched the horizon, painting the smoke-filled sky with streaks of crimson, the Afrika Korps began its retreat, engines sputtering, tracks damaged, and morale shaken by the realization that their greatest advantage, Rommel's instinctive, unpredictable assaults, had been turned against them by a British commander who fought not with speed but with foresight, and in that moment, as Rommel surveyed the losses, he whispered the name he had finally learned from intelligence reports, the name of the man who had transformed the British Army into an impenetrable force. Montgomery. As the pale morning light crept across the desert floor, revealing the wreckage of Rommel's shattered attack, Montgomery stood at the crest of a dune, watching the smoke rise in slow spirals from the battlefield like dark spirits drifting upward to the indifferent sky. And though exhaustion tugged at his limbs and the cold night had seeped into his bones, he remained as steady as the desert itself. His eyes sweeping the horizon not in celebration but in concentration, because he knew better than anyone that this battle, though decisive, was only the opening chapter of a far greater struggle for the soul of North Africa. The true test lay in how Rommel would respond, for the Desert Fox was a master not just of attack but of recovery. And Montgomery understood that the real war would be fought not only with guns and tanks but with decisions made in dim rooms, strategies scribbled in the margins of maps, and the psychological duel between two commanders who now understood each other better than ever before. British soldiers moved across the battlefield in silence, collecting wounded, extinguishing fires still flickering on the remains of German armor, and for many of them, the realization dawned that last night had been something historic. This was the first time they had not only survived a major German assault but repelled it with overwhelming force, and whispers spread through the ranks, whispers of Montgomery's foresight. Whispers that perhaps the tide was truly turning, and this quiet morale, like an ember glowing beneath the ashes, began to strengthen the backbone of the entire British 8th Army. In Rommel's camp, however, the mood was far darker. The Desert Fox sat in his field headquarters, maps scattered before him, his uniform covered in dust and smoke from the battlefield, and though his eyes still burned with the fierce intelligence that had earned him his reputation, there was a heaviness in his expression that his staff had never seen before, a mixture of frustration, exhaustion, and something dangerously close to fear, for Rommel had realized that the British commander he now faced did not fall for feints, did not crumble under pressure, and did not allow himself to be drawn into the kind of chaotic engagements that Rommel excelled at. Instead, Montgomery controlled the pace of battle with calculated precision, forcing Rommel into predictable paths, turning his strengths into liabilities, and that was a tactical shock to a man who had spent his career outsmarting opponents with ease. Rommel traced his fingers along the edge of the map, studying the British defensive grid, and his frustration deepened as he recognized the deliberate structure of it. This was not improvisation, not desperation, but a carefully designed system built specifically to choke off the maneuver warfare that the Afrika Korps depended on, and when reports came in of fuel shortages worsening, ammunition running dangerously low, and the Luftwaffe unable to provide adequate air support due to Allied air superiority. The Desert Fox felt the tightening grip of a reality he despised. The strategic situation was slipping beyond his control. Meanwhile, Montgomery gathered his senior officers for a morning briefing, the tent filled with the faint smell of coffee and dust, and as he spoke, he outlined the next phase of his plan with the same clarity that had guided the battle the night before. He would not allow Rommel time to reorganize, would not allow him to regain initiative, and instead would launch a series of controlled offensives designed to push the Germans back toward El Alamein, where the desert narrowed and offered no room for Rommel's sweeping maneuvers, effectively trapping the Afrika Korps between the ruthless desert and the relentless British advance. Throughout the day, British reconnaissance aircraft soared overhead, capturing images of German supply lines stretching thin across the vast sands, Italian divisions struggling with morale and coordination, and panzer units repositioning with decreasing efficiency, their mobility hindered by dwindling fuel reserves, and each report Montgomery received reinforced the truth he had known from the start. This was not just a battle of men but a battle of logistics, and the side with the stronger supply lines, the deeper reserves, and the more disciplined structure would inevitably prevail. Across the desert, Rommel paced inside his bunker, shadows flickering across the walls as a sandstorm gathered outside, and he knew that if he was to continue the fight, he needed reinforcements, fuel, and ammunition, supplies that were increasingly difficult to obtain as Allied naval and air forces tightened their grip over the Mediterranean, sinking convoys before they could reach the North African coast. The Desert Fox slammed his fist against the table, anger and desperation swirling inside him, and he dictated an urgent message to Berlin, requesting immediate support, emphasizing that without it, the Afrika Korps would be forced to retreat beyond repair. But in Berlin, Hitler's priorities were shifting, his arrogance clouding strategic judgment, and though reinforcements were promised, they would come too little and too late, leaving Rommel to confront the growing reality that he was being asked to win a campaign with resources that dwindled with each passing day. Meanwhile, Montgomery visited the frontline positions himself, walking calmly among the men, checking artillery placements, inspecting tank formations, exchanging brief words that carried the weight of confidence and discipline. He knew that his presence alone strengthened the morale of his troops, for they saw in him not a distant, unreachable figure but a commander who understood their struggles, who studied the enemy with almost supernatural clarity, and who carried himself with a calm that seeped into the hearts of everyone who served under him. The desert winds began to shift as afternoon approached, carrying with them the distant rumble of German engines as Rommel repositioned his forces, preparing for what he hoped would be a defensive stand until reinforcements arrived. He positioned his remaining panzers along the high ridges, placed anti-tank guns in concealed nests, and used the natural formations of the desert to create choke points, and as he surveyed the layout, he could not help but feel a grudging admiration for Montgomery's patience. This British commander did not rush into traps, did not reveal his intentions prematurely, and Rommel knew that any offensive Montgomery launched would be deliberate, precise, and deadly. In London, news of the British success in halting Rommel's advance began to spread, newspapers publishing cautious but optimistic headlines, and Prime Minister Churchill, upon hearing the reports, remarked to his staff with quiet satisfaction, "At last, we have a man in the desert," a statement that reflected the growing belief that Montgomery was the commander Britain had long needed, one capable not only of defending against the Desert Fox but defeating him. As night fell once more across the scorched landscape, Rommel sat outside his command vehicle, gazing toward the distant British lines, the stars above shimmering like cold diamonds scattered across the vast expanse of the desert sky, and he felt the weight of uncertainty pressing against his chest, because for the first time in the North African campaign, he was not sure what the next day would bring, nor whether he would have the supplies needed to withstand Montgomery's inevitable offensive. He thought of his men, exhausted but loyal, of the long months they had fought under the brutal sun, and he wondered how many more battles they could endure before the desert claimed them entirely. Montgomery, meanwhile, returned to his tent, the lantern casting a soft glow across the maps laid before him, and as he studied them once more, He felt the same unwavering clarity that had guided him since the moment he arrived in North Africa. Rommel was a brilliant adversary, one worthy of every ounce of strategy and discipline he could muster, but brilliance was no match for inevitability. And Montgomery understood that he was constructing not just a battle plan but a path that would lead inexorably to El Alamein, a battlefield where the desert narrowed, where Rommel's mobility would be strangled, and where the weight of British firepower and logistics would crush the Afrika Korps. And so, as both commanders prepared for the next phase of their duel, the Desert Fox struggling against time and supply, Montgomery tightening his grip with methodical precision, the desert itself seemed to hold its breath once again, knowing that the storm to come would decide not just the fate of North Africa but the future of the entire war. As two of the greatest military minds in history prepared for the clash that would define their legacies forever. As dawn broke over the desert once again, painting the sands with soft hues of amber and gold, Montgomery stood quietly beside his command vehicle, hands folded behind his back, his eyes trained on the faint silhouette of distant ridges where the Afrika Korps had withdrawn during the night, and though the battlefield seemed momentarily calm, he felt the unmistakable tension simmering beneath the silence. That electric stillness that always preceded a pivotal moment in war, for Montgomery knew. Rommel was not a commander who accepted defeat passively. The Desert Fox would regroup, reposition, and prepare to counterstrike with whatever strength remained at his disposal, and Montgomery intended to move faster than Rommel could recover. As the British officers gathered around him with updated intelligence reports, Montgomery's calm voice cut through the early morning chill as he explained that the time for defensive operations had passed. Now was the moment to begin the calculated push that would drive Rommel back toward the narrow spine of land around El Alamein, a region where the desert transformed into a natural choke point, denying the Afrika Korps their greatest weapon, movement. British reconnaissance aircraft soared overhead, returning with images that confirmed what Montgomery had anticipated. German lines were stretched, supply trucks were dispersed in scattered attempts to stay hidden from Allied bombers, and Italian units were faltering, their morale cracking under the weight of supply shortages and mounting casualties. And Montgomery knew that every logistical crack in the Axis lines was an opportunity waiting to be exploited. Across the desert, Rommel stood on the roof of his command vehicle, binoculars raised, scanning the endless horizon with the practiced eye of a man who had survived countless battles through instinct and intuition, and as he observed the British forces organizing with unnerving discipline, he felt a cold knot tightening in his gut, not out of fear but out of recognition. This was no longer the disjointed British army he had faced the year before. This was an opponent who understood rhythm, timing, and precision, an opponent who refused to be baited, an opponent who fought with a patience that strangled every maneuver Rommel attempted. Reports continued to arrive from his officers. Fuel supplies were dangerously low, ammunition stocks were insufficient for a prolonged engagement, and the Luftwaffe, battered by Allied air superiority, could not provide the air cover necessary for bold offensive operations. And as Rommel listened, the grim reality he had been trying to ignore pressed forward with crushing clarity. His supply lines had become his greatest vulnerability, and if you already watched till this part, so please comment below your city name. Let's continue the story. Without the resources needed to sustain mobility, his legendary tactics were being reduced to static defense, a role he despised. Montgomery, however, saw this moment as the long-awaited opening in the chess match he had been orchestrating since arriving in North Africa. He knew that the Afrika Korps could not outrun him now, could not weave through British lines with their usual grace, and he issued orders to prepare for Operation Lightfoot, the first major step in a relentless series of offensives designed to dismantle Rommel's ability to maneuver entirely. British engineers worked through the afternoon heat, preparing mine-clearing equipment, arranging supply convoys, and marking safe lanes through the vast minefields that Rommel had laid earlier in the campaign. And Montgomery walked among them with that same quiet determination that had carried him through every stage of this transformation. He understood that clearing the battlefield of danger was as much a psychological victory for his men as it was a tactical necessity, and every soldier who watched him pass felt a renewed sense of purpose ignite within them. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the desert, Rommel sat in his dimly lit command tent, poring over reports with furrowed brows and weary eyes, and when he looked up at his staff officers, he saw their worry reflected in their faces. They knew as well as he did that the next British offensive would be fierce, methodical, and relentless, and Rommel explained that their only hope lay in conserving fuel, rotating exhausted divisions out of the front lines, and creating defensive strongholds that could delay Montgomery long enough for reinforcements, if they ever arrived, to reach North Africa. But Rommel knew he was asking the impossible from men already stretched to their limits, and as he stepped outside into the cool desert night, the stars shimmering overhead like silent witnesses to the unfolding drama, he allowed himself a rare moment of vulnerability, wondering whether he still commanded the desert or whether the desert, shaped now by Montgomery's logic and British firepower, had begun to command him. Meanwhile, Montgomery returned to his headquarters, where lanterns flickered inside his tent and maps covered every surface, and as he studied the latest aerial photographs, he traced the lines of Rommel's defenses with calculated precision, noting every weakness, every fuel depot vulnerable to air attack, every Italian unit prone to collapse under pressure. He saw the battlefield not as it was but as it could become. An arena where discipline and predictability crushed speed and improvisation. A theater where Rommel's brilliance could no longer compensate for the brutal arithmetic of war. British bombers roared overhead throughout the night, streaking across the sky like dark phantoms, dropping explosive payloads onto German supply lines, fuel dumps, and staging grounds, and each explosion illuminated the desert in violent flashes that echoed across the dunes, sending ripples of panic through Rommel's already strained forces, while Montgomery watched the distant glow from his ridge-line command post, knowing that every destroyed convoy, every shattered fuel tank, pushed the Afrika Korps closer to collapse. As the night deepened, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of burning oil and scorched metal across the desert, and Montgomery wrapped his coat around himself, staring outward with a quiet intensity, feeling the weight of the moment as deeply as any soldier on the front lines. He knew the coming days would determine not just the outcome of the North African campaign but the trajectory of the entire war. For whoever controlled this desert corridor would control the gateway to the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and the vast resources that lay beyond. In the German camp, Rommel met with his officers in hushed voices, explaining that their only option now was to conserve what little strength remained and hold the line at all costs, hoping that the British advance could be slowed enough to buy time, and though none of his officers voiced their fears, they all knew that slowing Montgomery would only delay the inevitable unless reinforcements arrived, reinforcements that seemed increasingly unlikely. As dawn approached once again, painting the desert in soft hues of blue and pink, Montgomery rose from his brief rest, strapped on his field gear, and stepped into the cool morning air, where thousands of British soldiers were already preparing their equipment, their faces set with determination, and Montgomery knew the moment had come to carry out the next phase of his plan. An offensive that would push Rommel to the breaking point, and carve Montgomery's name into the very history of the desert. And so, as engines roared to life across the British lines and artillery crews took their positions, Montgomery looked toward the horizon where Rommel's battered army clung to the shifting sands, and he whispered to himself a truth he had known since the moment he arrived in North Africa. This ends at El Alamein. As the sun rose over the desert once more, casting long, sharp beams of gold across the dunes, Montgomery stood before his assembled officers and outlined the next stage of the unfolding campaign. The deliberate push that would force Rommel to retreat into the bottleneck of El Alamein, the place where the desert narrowed into a corridor flanked by impassable salt marshes and unforgiving cliffs, where maneuver warfare died and sheer firepower reigned, and as he spoke, his voice calm but filled with a quiet intensity, the officers around him recognized that Montgomery saw the desert not as a battlefield but as a massive, living instrument that he could bend and shape to his will, each ridge and wadi a tool in a larger design meant to suffocate the Afrika Korps' mobility and strip Rommel of his legendary speed. British engineers moved tirelessly across the sand, clearing mines, marking routes, and reinforcing positions for the coming offensive, while supply convoys arrived in steady waves, bringing ammunition, fuel, and rations in quantities Rommel could only dream of, and as Montgomery surveyed the growing logistical machine behind him, He understood that war was rarely won by brilliance alone, it was won by preparation, discipline, and the relentless accumulation of advantages until the enemy could do nothing but crumble beneath their weight. Across the desert, Rommel stood silently beside the remains of a bombed German supply truck, his expression unreadable as he ran his hand across the jagged metal, feeling the heat of the explosion still lingering against his palm. He was exhausted, drained by the constant pressure, by the endless reports of destroyed fuel depots and intercepted convoys, by the knowledge that the Luftwaffe could no longer protect him from the skies and the supply routes from Europe were collapsing under the relentless assault of Allied naval forces. And though he tried to maintain the aura of confidence for his men, deep inside he felt the creeping dread that he was fighting not just Montgomery but the entire weight of the British Empire and American industrial power combined. Rommel held meetings late into the night with his senior officers, discussing defensive lines, fallback positions, and the increasingly impossible task of holding El Alamein with depleted resources. He spoke with a forced steadiness, laying out plans for delaying actions and controlled retreats, but his officers could see the cracks in his composure. The faint tremor in his voice each time he mentioned fuel shortages or ammunition stocks, and when he finally dismissed them, Rommel stepped outside into the cold desert air, gazing up at the stars above as though seeking guidance from a sky that offered none, the vast constellations indifferent to the suffering of the men below. Meanwhile, Montgomery walked the British lines, stopping to speak with tank crews, infantrymen, and engineers, his presence bringing a sense of stability that hardened their morale. Soldiers who had once doubted their chances now felt the confidence of a commander who never rushed, never panicked, who made every decision with the precision of a man who had already imagined the next 10 steps of the battle. And they whispered among themselves that if anyone could finally turn the desert war, it was Monty, the calm storm standing at the center of the British Eighth Army. As preparations continued, British bombers launched nightly raids on German positions, their engines rumbling like thunder across the darkness as they dropped bombs in devastating waves, lighting up the desert in violent flashes that illuminated craters, shattered vehicles, and soldiers scrambling for cover, while Montgomery watched from afar, knowing that every explosion meant one less supply truck for Rommel, one less tank fueled, one less artillery barrage unleashed on his own men when the final battle came. Throughout the following days, the British offensive advanced with a deliberate rhythm, pressing the Afrika Korps steadily backward, not in wild charges but in controlled, methodical movements that mirrored Montgomery's strategic doctrine: advance only when supply lines were secure, strike only when the enemy was forced into predictable patterns, and never allow Rommel the opportunity to regain initiative. German units fell back toward El Alamein, abandoning positions they could no longer hold, fighting fierce rearguard actions but sacrificing more equipment than they could replace, and Rommel, observing these retreats from his command vehicle, clenched his jaw as the reality sank deeper with each passing hour. His army was being squeezed, not through speed or overwhelming force, but through a slow, strangling pressure that drained strength from the Afrika Korps with every mile lost. Montgomery, for his part, pushed forward with calculated patience, ordering artillery to maintain constant fire on retreating German columns, instructing armored units to pressure the flanks without overextending, and emphasizing again and again that this was a war of endurance, not impulse. He knew Rommel was desperate for a breakthrough opportunity, a chance to counterstrike with whatever panzers remained operational. And Montgomery's greatest fear was not the Germans he could see but the trap Rommel might still be capable of setting if the British advanced too quickly. But Rommel's capacity for bold action had been severely diminished. His tanks sputtered from lack of fuel, his men were exhausted from days without proper rest or supplies, and the Italian divisions supporting him were collapsing under strain, their inexperienced officers unable to maintain cohesion under Montgomery's relentless pressure. Rommel spent long hours writing messages to Berlin, pleading for reinforcements, for fuel shipments, for air support, but the answers that came were vague promises, bureaucratic delays, and orders that made little sense from commanders far removed from the desert's crushing reality, and Rommel felt a bitter frustration boil inside him, not at the Afrika Korps, not even at Montgomery, but at the distant leadership that no longer understood what the war in North Africa had become, a slow, grinding attrition where mobility, the very heart of Rommel's strategy, had been crippled beyond salvation. As the Afrika Korps fell back into the narrowing confines of the Alamein corridor, Montgomery's plan began to take on its final shape. He envisioned a battlefield where Rommel could no longer dance through the dunes, no longer execute sweeping flanking maneuvers or lightning raids, but would instead be forced into a static defense against the full weight of the British Eighth Army, and Montgomery knew that in such a setting, with overwhelming artillery, armored strength, and air superiority, the outcome would be inevitable. British artillery units dug into positions along ridges overlooking the German lines, their guns arranged in a vast semicircle capable of unleashing a storm of fire at a moment's notice, while infantry fortified their trenches with machine gun nests and barbed wire, preparing for the final confrontation that Montgomery believed would end Rommel's ability to wage war in North Africa. Across the no-man's land that separated the two armies, Rommel watched British positions through his field glasses, noting the density of Montgomery's preparations, and though he tried to maintain the legendary confidence that had carried him through so many impossible battles, he felt a hollow ache in his chest as he realized that the desert, once his greatest ally, had been turned against him. The narrow corridor of El Alamein offered no escape, no flanking routes, no maneuvering room, only a brutal, head-on confrontation that he knew Montgomery was carefully preparing for with the patience of a man who understood that victory was not a matter of if, but when. As night fell and the desert firestorms subsided into a tense silence, Montgomery sat alone in his tent, studying the map by lantern light, tracing the lines of Rommel's defenses, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him like the growing heat of the desert sun. He understood that the final battle was approaching, that Rommel's strength was nearly spent, and that the next phase would determine whether the long war for North Africa would come to an end under his command. Rommel, in his own 10 miles away, sat in silence as well, the faint glow of a lantern illuminating the exhaustion etched into his features, and though his staff urged him to rest, he remained awake, staring at the map that had once represented opportunity, now reduced to a trap closing in on him, and with a heavy breath he acknowledged the truth he had long resisted. Montgomery had become the immovable wall he could not break. The commander whose foresight suffocated every maneuver, the strategist who understood him too deeply. And as the desert wind whispered through the campfires of both armies, carrying with it the scent of sand, sweat, and destiny, the stage was set for the confrontation that would define not only the North African campaign but the legacies of both commanders. The night when the desert fox would face the one hunter he could not outrun. As the final night before the decisive battle settled over the desert, an eerie calm swept through the camps of both armies, the vast North African sands lying still under a dome of stars so brilliant they seemed almost unreal, shimmering like fragments of a broken sky scattered across the darkness, and Montgomery stood alone on a ridge, the cold desert wind brushing against his face as he gazed toward the faint glow of the German encampment in the distance, where tiny flickers of campfires marked the last restless hours of the Afrika Korps before dawn would deliver them into the crucible he had prepared. He inhaled deeply, feeling the weight of history, responsibility, and expectation pressing on his chest, yet beneath it all, there was a steady calm, the calm of a man who had shaped the battlefield into a weapon, who had turned the desert into an ally, and who knew that by sunrise, the inevitable reckoning between his methodical discipline and Rommel's desperate improvisation would begin. In the German camp, Rommel limped slightly as he walked between the rows of exhausted soldiers, many of whom lay on thin blankets staring up at the sky, wondering if this would be their last night alive. He stopped to speak with officers, checking on defensive lines, personally inspecting the remaining panzers, many battered, some barely functioning. And each time he laid a hand on the steel hull of a tank or the shoulder of a weary soldier, he felt a painful swell of loyalty and regret, because he knew they deserved better than what the dwindling German supply machine could offer. Rommel's mind raced as he returned to his tent, the lantern inside casting long shadows across the map strewn with grease pencil markings and pins pushed deep into the canvas, symbols of battles fought, maneuvers executed, and now, defenses hastily formed under the crushing pressure of a foe who refused to surrender momentum. He lowered himself onto a folding chair. staring at the map until the lines blurred, and for the first time in the campaign, he allowed himself to whisper the truth he had never spoken aloud. "We cannot win this." Yet even in that admission, his resolve hardened, for Rommel had always believed that if victory slipped beyond reach, then honor demanded he fight until every possible ounce of resistance had been given, and so he composed himself, straightened his posture, and began issuing final instructions for the coming battle, ensuring that his remaining forces would not collapse without inflicting maximum damage. If they were to fall, they would do so like lions. Meanwhile, Montgomery convened his officers in a dimly lit tent where the atmosphere crackled with anticipation, and as he stood before them, hands behind his back, he spoke with the calm authority that had come to define him, explaining that the artillery bombardment would begin just before sunrise, a thunderous prelude designed to shake the German defensive line and mask the movement of the infantry behind it. He reviewed the timing of armored thrusts, the placement of mine-clearing engineers, the role of each division in the battle plan, and though his voice never rose, every officer present felt the magnitude of the moment. This was not merely another engagement, but the final blow meant to crack Rommel's hold over North Africa and usher in the turning of the tide. As the hours crawled forward, Montgomery walked the front one last time, greeting soldiers preparing for the assault, offering nods and words of encouragement, projecting confidence even though he knew the coming hours would be brutal, and as he returned to his observation post, he paused, looking out at the faint line of the German defenses across the desert, and whispered quietly to himself, "This is where it ends." The first hint of dawn began to brighten the horizon, and in Rommel's camp, soldiers stirred as officers shouted final commands, engines sputtered to life, and artillery crews scrambled to their firing positions. Rommel stepped into his command vehicle, gripping the edge of the hatch tightly, his face pale but resolute, his eyes glinting with a mixture of determination and sorrow, for he knew this battle was not about victory anymore. It was about survival, about dignity, about showing the world that the Afrika Korps could still fight with discipline and honor even as fate turned against them. Then, without warning, the desert exploded. British artillery unleashed a barrage so immense the very ground trembled, shells screaming overhead like fire-tipped arrows before erupting across the German lines in a frenzy of light and thunder that shattered the stillness of dawn. Dust plumes rose in thick clouds, obscuring the sun, while German soldiers dove for cover, some scrambling into trenches, others firing blindly through the haze, their defenses buckling under the sheer weight of the bombardment. Montgomery watched the bombardment unfold with studied focus, his binoculars pressed to his eyes as he tracked the timing of explosions and issued subtle adjustments to the fire pattern, ensuring that every shell landed according to design. He was not just unleashing destruction, he was sculpting the battlefield, preparing the perfect conditions for the armored and infantry advance that would follow. When the bombardment finally ceased, a deep silence swallowed the desert, the air thick with smoke and dust, and in that silent vacuum, British infantry surged forward, moving in disciplined waves supported by tanks that rolled like steel beasts unleashed from their chains. Mine-clearing teams advanced carefully through corridors carved by artillery, marking safe paths with white tape while German machine guns, dazed but determined, opened fire from whatever positions remained intact. Rommel barked urgent orders as he watched his front line disintegrate in the initial assault, but his communications were unreliable, units scattered, and his tank crews struggled to maneuver through the cratered terrain. Still, they fought with fierce tenacity, firing at advancing British armor, executing counterstrikes wherever possible, but each time they mounted a defense, Montgomery's reserve units surged forward, reinforcing the advance in a perfectly timed rhythm that suffocated any attempt to push the British back. British armor clashed with panzers at point-blank range in some sectors, the desert echoing with the violent roar of engines and the deafening boom of tank shells, flames erupting from steel hulls as both sides paid a heavy price in the crucible of battle. Yet despite their bravery, the Afrika Korps could not sustain the intensity. Fuel shortages forced some tanks to remain idle, ammunition began running dangerously low, and German officers found themselves making impossible choices, deciding which units to support and which to abandon as Montgomery's relentless pressure fractured their lines. Rommel himself moved from one position to another, exposed to gunfire as he attempted to rally his men, his presence boosting their morale even as the situation worsened. But each time he arrived at a defensive sector, he found the same scene: exhausted soldiers clinging to shattered positions, tanks destroyed or immobilized, Italian units overwhelmed by the ferocity of the assault, and British forces pressing forward with a discipline and confidence that made the Afrika Korps seem like a shadow of its former self. Montgomery, observing from his command post, maintained a constant flow of orders, committing reserves with pinpoint timing, adjusting artillery strikes in response to German counterattacks, and ensuring that no hole in the British advance grew large enough for Rommel to exploit. He fought the battle as if conducting an orchestra, each unit playing its part at just the right moment, and as the hours of brutal combat dragged on, the inevitability of the outcome grew clearer with every passing minute. By midday, deep cracks had opened in the German line, gaps through which British infantry poured like a flood, encircling pockets of resistance and seizing key ridges that offered vantage points across the battlefield. Rommel watched in anguish as his defensive plan collapsed, his once proud Afrika Korps splintering under the overwhelming weight of Montgomery's coordinated assault. And he felt his spirit waver as he realized he was witnessing not just a defeat, but the disintegration of his army. As the sun descended toward the horizon, painting the desert in shades of crimson and gold, British troops pushed the Afrika Korps into a full retreat, and Montgomery issued the final orders that would solidify the victory: armored divisions to pursue, infantry to secure captured positions, engineers to clear newly gained territory of mines and unexploded ordnance. Every detail executed with the same precision that had carried him through the entire campaign. In the fading light, Rommel stood beside his battered command car, staring out at the long lines of wounded soldiers and smoldering wreckage scattered across the desert, and with a heavy heart he knew there was only one course left. He issued the order to withdraw, to save what remained of his men, to preserve a fragment of the Afrika Korps before it was utterly annihilated, and as the remnants of his army retreated westward. Rommel took one last look at the battlefield, whispering with quiet bitterness, "Montgomery, you were the shadow I could not escape." Montgomery watched the retreat through his binoculars, the weight of the victory settling slowly upon him, not triumph, not celebration, but the solemn recognition of what had been accomplished. The Desert Fox had been stopped, his mobility crushed, his aura broken, and the long, grueling war for North Africa had reached its decisive turning point. And as the desert wind swept across the battlefield, carrying with it the echoes of gunfire and the smoke of burning steel, Montgomery stood still, boots planted firmly in the sand, knowing that history would remember this day as the moment when one commander's discipline overcame another commander's brilliance, when the desert itself bowed to strategy, and when the legend of Rommel met the immovable will of Bernard Montgomery. Two giants whose duel had shaped the fate of a continent. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered, and we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.